So, as a mum of four, I will tell you that I found parenting my first two children reasonably easy, and I patted myself on the back and thought that I was rather marvelous at parenting. I've now got four children and realized that that's potentially was more of a personality uh, of the child rather than me being such a wonderful mother. But why are some children more difficult to parent than others in your experience?
Um, so there's a lot of things. First of all, I'd like to say that you're probably just a wonderful mother, full stop. And being able to parent the children that we're given, because they are all individual, right? And this is what I often say to families is you've got to kind of meet the child where the child is, because even a child will be different. Some children are very variable. They're very inconsistent in their presentations, and it can get really challenging for a parent to stay consistent when their child is really inconsistent. Some children are more challenging than others because they have differences in temperament, as you've identified there. Um, Sometimes there might be neurodiversity sitting there that has or hasn't been identified. Sometimes there are traumas, and sometimes what we define as a trauma is not necessarily something that can be they can have traumas that have been activated and you might not even know. So it might be an ongoing bullying situation at school that you haven't necessarily found out about. That's still a trauma. That still creates trauma-based behaviors. It basically makes their stress trigger a bit tighter and it's going to go off more easily. And for some kids, it's a combination of those things. So, for example, some of our kids with neurodiversity, just going to school and being in that sensory environment can be traumatic for them. So they can have everyday trauma related to their neurodiversity in the context of being in the community or being in the school, just as an example. So it can be really variable. And the way I work is very individualized. So even in the groups, I talk to parents about them identifying what the actual underlying challenges and needs and triggers are for their child, because they're all going to be different. Just like us as adults, they're all different. Some of us don't like listening to somebody else eat next to us. Others of us don't like sticky things, sticky labels on things. We've all got our own little sensory preferences and our own self-talk, our own inner coach, inner critic sort of stuff that goes on as well. So, and kids, on top of that, their little brains are still developing, their regulation's still developing. And the biggest thing that I find I work on with families to coach their kids on, so I coach the families, the parents, and then they coach the kids, is to build executive functioning skills.
So what does that mean?
So often children that have poor executive functioning skills are having trouble with things like regulation, problem solving, planning, motor planning, practice sequencing, difficulties with persisting when something gets hard, task persistence, difficulties with sustaining motivation over time to something that I'm not interested in particularly, if that makes sense. Um, so these are all executive functions that occur in our, prefrontal lobe.
So I'd love to stop you there. I'd love some tips on that one. So getting someone to persevere with a task that they find boring. Uh, can you give us some tips for that?
So the problem might be, the child's not persisting with, what are they not persisting with, Dr. Shauna? Can you give
I'm
me an
not
example?
persisting with a chore.
Okay, so what's the chore we're talking
Okay,
about?
unloading the dishwasher.
Yeah, I was going to go with unloading the dishwasher anyway. So, okay, so first of all, I would be considering in my mind, are they not unloading the dishwasher? Although the unloading of the dishwasher, everything's clean. So sometimes kids don't like loading the dishwasher or doing the dishes because they have sensory differences as well. But unloading the dishwasher. So I would actually use this tool and we would identify the problem as, you've got this chore and that's to unload the dishwasher every day, but it's not happening. And then there's a whole bunch of agreements around this that we're actually going to use our tools for calming before and as we need to during the conversation. We're going to speak kindly to each other. And we're actually going to persist together to come up with a solution. And pretty much the fun stops until we can actually solve this problem. I actually had this tool in this very blue folder when my kids were little. And when I got the blue folder out, and I know if you're just listening on podcast, you can't actually see it, but if when I got the blue folder out, my children very quickly would go, "Oh, but we have a problem tool's coming." And they would start to solve problems. So I started this when my kids were about 2 and 5. Two's probably a little bit young for most kids, but I modified the language considerably for my daughter and she was able to participate. By the time they were sort of 5 and 8, they were doing this very independently and able to actually come up with solutions themselves. So then we actually come up with a series of brainstorm solutions. And as the parent, we write them down or we draw them for them. And, I always say, make sure you're putting on there every crazy idea that your child comes up with. Get that child's voice on that piece of paper. And to be honest, sometimes my kids came up with solutions that were amazing that I would not have. And I've had other parents tell me the same thing when they use this tool. So you actually just brainstorm a whole bunch of solutions to this problem. It might be that, Mum, you're going to remind me, or I'm going to set a timer on my iPad, or I'm not going to open my iPad or my, gaming device until I've done this, or I'm going to, but let them come up with it, because if it's come from them, they're much more likely to then persist with it. And then you also go through that, decide what you can agree on together, and then you have that agreement. And then you also come up with, well, what happens if we break this agreement? What happens if Mum breaks this agreement? What happens if you break this agreement? And again, kids are really good at coming up with consequences for themselves that are fair and reasonable. It's actually surprising. You think they wouldn't do it, but they can. And the other part of it is you're just reminding them, hey, we can go and do that fun thing that you want to do as soon as we've got this solved and as soon as we're in agreement about this. So you don't have to agree to something that's unreasonable. You have to sort of come to that, but letting them lead it.
So I've got two questions for you on that. So first one is, so is it reasonable to let the person who potentially has some neurodiversity or sensory issues, for them to say they can't load the dishwasher because they don't want to touch items of plates and things that have got food on them? So we have this in our house. So all my other children have had to load and unload the dishwasher. My son can't stand touching it. Of course, my older children think it's a cop-out and they think I'm letting him away with it. But my compromise is that he unloads the dishwasher. Is that fair, or should we be pushing children who have a sensory issue to touch things that they don't want to touch?
Okay, so there's two questions there, really, isn't there? So the first question about the sensory needs, I would never force a child with sensory needs to touch something that they don't want to touch, because all you're actually doing, so they've already got a more sensitive system, and what you're actually doing is worsening that activation of that system every time you make that child do something that's already activating a stress response in them. And the analogy I often use when I talk to parents about that is, if you can imagine a huntsman crawling across your back, the sensation that you have with that, like a really big fat hairy spider crawling across your back, the sensation you have with that, that's the activation that our tactily defensive kids are having. So if you continue to activate that, what's actually going to happen is their frontal lobe, their thinking brain's going to disconnect. And then all those executive functions that we're trying to actually strengthen and connect with and build, they're offline. It's like they're offline, and we're just being driven by the amygdala, which is our real stress system, right? Our emotional system. And that's when you're actually going to get much more volatile meltdowns, tantrums, those sorts of things. So, no. What I would suggest, Shauna, is that you do the We Have a Problem tool with all your children as a committee. You sit down and you go, okay, we have individualized things for each of you. Each of you have preferences and not preferences. This is the list of chores that we need to get done. Who's going to do what, when, and how? How are we going to work this together as a team? Okay. And I'll share my experience for you. The other part that I found with my son, who is sensitive, slow to warm up, doesn't like change very much. He can adjust to change. He just needs more time and more exposure to get to that. Is that when I tried to implement a chore schedule where he and his sister and anybody else who was staying in our house, because we've had a few other kids stay in our house at times, had to exchange jobs, like say weekly or whatever, he would fight with me every time he had to do the job. He was happy to unload the dishwasher. He was actually happy to take the rubbish out. Over time, we added that. He was happy to do, like there was 3 or 4 jobs that over time as he got older, we added in, and he was happy to do those. And when they became a routine and he just did them, they just got done without conflict. And so our solution was to work to strength again. What's his strength? Once he's mastered a routine, he's really great at that. He loves that and he's willing to do it. And to this day, that's what he does in our house. He helps us with those things. Even as a 20-year-old, that's all his job. And what I did over time I layered in more and more. So he's very anxious about cooking food because, again, there's lots of sensory stuff in there, but I've taught him lots of meals now, and he does dinner one night a week and cleans the whole kitchen. And he's really, really good at it.
Okay, that's great. Suzie, I know that you also mentioned trying to get the kids to come up with their own consequences. One of the consequences that comes up a lot in my practice and also with friends and kids is, parents taking phones away, taking iPads away, stopping kids from playing their computer games or whatever for X number of hours, days, weeks, whatever it happens to be. Do you have an opinion on that and whether that's a good strategy or not a good strategy?
I think all kids have a currency. So what I mean by that is all kids have something that is really important to them. I think for me, this comes back to values-based intentional parenting. And this is the strategies that I teach and worked really well with my kids. So when I talk about values-based parenting, I mean being really aware of it, like taking a step back from the chaos of everyday parenting and being really aware of what's most important to you as a parent. So basically you're thinking about who's the 20-year-old that's going to walk in the door for Sunday night dinner to come visit you? What values are they going to be as a young adult, even when they're only 2 or 3 or baby or, in primary school age? Who do you want walking through the door once they're grown? And thinking about what's important to you, and then you can actually parent from there. And the reason I tell this is because the way I parented around screens was, my view was very clearly, let's set a routine. You're allowed this amount of time and that's it. But I also had, one of my core values was connection, still is connection. And so my kids knew that if I said, hey, and I wanted to talk to them, no matter what they were doing, if they were in the middle of a game, if they were in the middle of a YouTube, if they were in the middle of messaging a friend, that they needed to acknowledge me. And they could say, I'll be a sec, I just want to finish this message. But they needed to acknowledge, mum wants to connect, mum wants to talk to me, or the device would be taken away for a period of time. Now, I never did very long. I usually just took it away maybe for the night, but it was based on the value of connection. And to this day, my kids walk around with one AirPod in because they know if I go, hey, and they've got to go, yes, mum, because it's trained, right? I taught them from really young, and it's like a training thing. And now it's just an automatic response, even at a 16, 17-year-old, 20-year-old level. So I think if you think about values and what that means, and in terms of me allowing them to say, give me 1 minute or let me finish this game, for me as an adult, if I'm in the middle of an email and my kids go, Mom, I'll say, give me a minute, I've got to finish this, and I'll be there in a minute because I've run, businesses for years and years since they were tiny. So I feel like I need to be respectful and do that back and let them finish that little thought.
For anyone listening who hasn't followed a values-based parenting strategy, I'd love you to first of all, explain what it is, and also, is it too late if you've already got teenagers, or can people introduce this at any stage?
It's not too late at all. You can introduce it at any stage. You could even introduce it with adults once you've already got adult families and have them bring it in. Because my children were little, I very much directed what values and I was a single parent. So I went through and I worked through myself. And I actually went through, you kind of go through a bit of an evolution because you try some on for size, and then you go, actually, that doesn't work. I need something else here. So, for example, I had connection, kindness, and compassion as my values originally. But what I found was my very sensitive boy, he was just snuggling into that, right? And not wanting to go out into the big, scary world and interact with it. Yeah. And at that time, I actually read Gifts for Imperfection by Brene Brown, and I started getting into Brene Brown. And once I got into Brene Brown's work, I added bravery. So we had kindness, connection, and bravery. And that's where I parented from for the duration then from when probably my daughter was 3 or 4. So she's now almost 17. She's 17 in a couple of weeks. So no, you can start anywhere. I would suggest though, if you're going to do this with teenagers, probably from about 14, 15 plus, I would very much I would do it as a group. I would try and do those activities as a group and think through those processes as a group and whittle it down to your 3 or 4 core values as a group. With primary school age children through tweens and early, up to about 13, I would get their input, but I would still probably be leading that as the parent. So I would get them to help you highlight the ones that they like, tell you why, all of those sorts of things, and incorporate that in your thinking. But as the parent or parents together, I would still be probably directing that and then explaining to the kids, so glad to have your voice in this discussion. And this is why we've chosen these. This is what we're going to start with. And we'll see how we go from there.
When I started this podcast back in December 23, I knew that I was lucky enough to have amazing conversations with various health professionals across all facets of medicine and allied health. And I knew that you would probably really enjoy being a fly on the wall to hear what we talked about. And that's how the podcast was born. And what you probably don't know is that this is a bit of a passion project. We don't have any sponsors or funding. And without your help, we won't be able to continue bringing you these great guests. So if you can please spread the word about the podcast, share it with someone who you think might benefit from the conversation that you've just listened to, or if you can leave us a review or a comment, it would mean the absolute world, because that actually helps the podcast spread further and get more people to hear our message and hopefully allow us to invite bigger and bigger guests onto the show. And I would so appreciate you helping me back. Thank you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.